When a park ranger sets out on his routine patrol, the first desperate cries he hears send chills down his spine. What seemed like a normal day at first takes a sinister turn as the pieces unravel, revealing a dark truth, one that puts innocent lives in unimaginable danger. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. It was early morning when Henry Dawson emerged from the ranger station, inhaling the crisp scent of pine carried by the cool mountain breeze. The sprawling expanse of Ironwood National Forest stretched out before him, ancient evergreens towering under a slowly brightening sky. The sun had not yet crested the rugged peaks to the east, so the woods still held a hushed, blue-tinged twilight. Henry had patrolled these grounds for years, yet every day still felt charged with the mystery and possibility that came with protecting such a vast wilderness. He slipped on his ranger hat, faded at the brim from years of use, and adjusted the backpack that carried his usual supplies: first aid kit, flashlight, extra water, a snack or two. He'd also brought along an old camera he sometimes used to photograph wildlife or track changes in the forest flora. That morning, though, he felt a curious knot in his stomach, a sense of unease he couldn't quite pin down. Maybe it was just the dimness before full sunrise. Or maybe it was that half-forgotten dream he'd had the night before, a flash of memory about the rescue that still haunted him, though he tried his best to keep it buried. He locked the station door and made his way to the ranger truck parked on a gravel path. Inside, the shortwave radio crackled softly with static. Ironwood wasn't known for large crowds of tourists. Only the hardiest hikers ventured into certain remote areas. The morning's itinerary was simple enough: drive along the perimeter to check on a newly cleared trail, make sure signage was still intact, and do a quick pass around the southwestern quadrant. Easy work, normally. But something about this morning felt different, like the forest itself was holding its breath. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, headlights cutting through the early gloom. As he navigated the narrow dirt roads that laced through the trees, he kept an eye out for fallen branches or signs of overnight storms. The radio was mostly silent. No chatter from other rangers, no calls for help. He tried to settle his nerves by focusing on the forest's beauty: faint beams of dawn painting the trunks of pines gold, the quiet stir of small animals scampering through the underbrush, and the crisp air that set a slight shiver along his arms. After half an hour, he reached the southwestern quadrant's gravel parking area, where a couple of popular trails began. He parked, hopped out, and took a moment to stretch. The hush here felt thicker somehow, almost foreboding. He walked a few yards toward a new directional sign, intending to confirm if it was still in good shape. That was when he heard it, a distant cry, sharp and panicked, echoing through the pines. He froze, heart thudding against his ribs. He'd heard plenty of noises in the woods, some from startled hikers, others from animals, but this sounded human and desperate. Another voice chimed in, higher-pitched. It sounded like children shouting for help. He wasted no time, sprinting toward the direction of the voices. They weren't on the main trail. The sound came from somewhere deeper in the forest. Underbrush snagged at his uniform pants as he veered off the beaten path. He ducked under low-hanging branches, panting, straining to keep track of the faint cries. "Hello!" Henry shouted, twisting around a thick stand of ferns. "Keep calling out. I'm coming." A child's voice answered, trembling with fear. "Help! Over here!" Henry pushed forward, the terrain growing rugged and uneven. His boots skidded on damp patches of moss. At last, he broke into a small clearing, panting, his chest tight from exertion. There, near the base of a huge pine tree, two children huddled together, a girl on the cusp of adolescence, maybe 11 or 12, and a younger boy, perhaps 8 or 9. Their clothes were torn and smeared with mud. Their faces were flushed and streaked with tears. The girl held her little brother protectively. Henry raised both hands to show he was no threat, trying to keep his voice calm. Hey, it's all right. I'm a park ranger. My name is Henry. Are you hurt? The children stared at him, wide-eyed, as if they couldn't believe someone was really there to help. The boy clutched at the girl's arm, trembling so hard his whole body shook. Finally, the girl spoke in a wavering voice. We ran away. The men, they took our parents. Henry felt a jolt of alarm shoot through him. Men took your parents? But who are you? She swallowed hard, trying to gather herself. I'm Charlotte. This is Oliver. Our mom and dad, she stifled a sob. They were kidnapped at the lodge. We got away, but we don't know where we are or how to get help. Henry inched closer, gently wrapping his coat around the shivering boy's shoulders. Oliver pressed against his sister. How long have you been out here? Henry asked, scanning for any sign of injuries. Charlotte's voice was hushed. All night. Maybe longer. I don't know. His mind raced. Kidnappers at a lodge? People taken hostage? Ironwood National Forest was remote, sure, but kidnappings weren't common. Okay, let's get you two to safety first. He took out a canteen of water and passed it to them. Drink. Slowly. They both gulped water as though they hadn't had a drop in days. Charlotte coughed, then forced herself to speak. They took Mom and Dad and, she hesitated, eyes welling with tears. They said they were going to sell them. Henry's stomach lurched. Sell them? You heard them say that? Charlotte nodded miserably. They talked about them like property. Henry had encountered his share of criminals in the forest, poachers, drug traffickers, but this was another level. He pressed his lips into a tight line, trying to maintain composure. We need to get you both somewhere safe. We'll call for help. He helped them up, noticing how the boy stumbled, nearly collapsing with fatigue. Let me carry you, Henry offered, but Oliver shook his head fiercely. Henry decided not to push it. Instead, he supported the child's weight, letting him lean on his arm. Charlotte clung to Henry's jacket, still shaking, but with a resolve that belied her age. Something about her unwavering, watchful gaze told him she was determined to help her family, no matter what. They returned to Henry's truck, stumbling over rocks and ferns in their haste. As they neared the parking area, Henry couldn't help but scan the trees, worried that kidnappers might lurk nearby. Once they reached the truck, he opened the passenger door and ushered them inside. Oliver whimpered as he climbed onto the seat belt snapping around his small frame. Charlotte got in next, arms folded around her little brother. Henry hopped into the driver's seat and grabbed the radio. This is Ranger Dawson, he said, voice clipped with urgency. I have 2 minors in my vehicle, found them deep in southwestern quadrant. Possible kidnapping situation. Request immediate backup and contact with local authorities. Static hissed, then a crackly voice responded. Copy that, Dawson. Dispatching state troopers and county sheriff's department. Stand by. Henry glanced over at the children. Charlotte was fighting tears, Oliver's eyes wide and lost. You two are going to be okay, Henry murmured. I won't let anything happen to you. He started the engine and turned onto the dirt road that wound back to the ranger depot. The ride was bumpy, but at least they were moving toward help. As he drove, he pressed for more details. Charlotte, do you remember anything about the men who took your parents? Anything at all that might help? She shuddered. They wore black. They had guns. I remember seeing some kind of patch on one guy's jacket, but I couldn't read it in the dark. The lodge staff didn't even scream. It was like they knew it was coming. Oliver's voice was small, barely above a whisper. They used a van. It was black, I think, or maybe dark blue. They said something about crossing the border. I heard the word exchange. Henry's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Trafficking, kidnapping, crossing state lines. This was big, terrifyingly big. Your parents, Mark and Lillian, right? Is that correct? Charlotte looked surprised. Yes, Mark and Lillian Byrne. How did you? You said your last name was Byrne. That's all I needed. Don't worry. Henry managed a grim smile. We'll get them back. The sun had finally crept above the treeline, shedding pale yellow light across the forest canopy, but Henry's mood felt anything but bright. The fear in Charlotte's and Oliver's eyes stoked old memories he'd kept locked away. The day he'd lost someone he'd tried to save, a rescue that failed in the final moments. He set his jaw, forcing himself to focus on the present. This time would be different. By the time they arrived at the Ranger Depot, an unassuming one-story structure with a small parking lot, 2 sheriff's vehicles were already there, red and blue lights flashing. Sheriff Byron Hale, a stout man with graying hair, strode over to greet Henry as he parked. Deputy Linda Torres and Deputy Pete Grayson followed. Henry hopped out, trying to keep calm. "Sheriff, these kids are Charlotte and Oliver Byrne. Their parents were taken from the Ironwood Lodge. Kidnappers, armed, likely organized. They might still be in the area." Hale's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. He gestured for the deputies to help the children inside. "All right, let's get them warm, get statements. The FBI might need to be called in if this crosses state lines." Henry looked back at the children as they were guided into the depot's small lounge. Oliver clung to Charlotte's hand, casting frightened glances at the deputies. Henry followed them, explaining what little he knew. Emma Caldwell, a young ranger who often handled first aid and administrative tasks, rushed to bring blankets and warm drinks for the children. She shot Henry a worried look. "They must be terrified. Are they hurt?" "They look mostly unharmed, just exhausted and shaken up," Henry said. "But yes, they're terrified." Inside the lounge, Charlotte and Oliver perched on a worn leather couch. Emma draped a blanket over them while Deputy Torres crouched in front, speaking in a gentle tone. "Hey there, I'm Linda. I'm going to ask you a few questions, okay? Just tell me everything you remember." Oliver's lower lip trembled. "Will we get Mom and Dad back?" Torres offered a soft smile. "We'll do everything we can." While the children gave their initial statements, Henry stepped aside with Sheriff Hale to fill him in on the details. The sheriff scribbled in a notepad, eyes narrowed. "We don't handle kidnappings like this too often," he admitted. "I'll get the state troopers involved, maybe the FBI. But if this is a trafficking ring, it's bigger than our small county can manage alone." Henry nodded. "I agree. Time is crucial. If they're planning on moving Mark and Lillian out of state, we need to act fast." Hale sighed. "All right, I'll make some calls." He eyed Henry, noticing the tension carved into the ranger's features. "You look like a man who's seen something like this before." Henry felt that old pang in his chest. "Not exactly this. But I've been on tough rescues. And I've seen what happens when you're too late." Hale studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll take all the help I can get." Within the hour, more official vehicles arrived. 2 state troopers took over the perimeter, scanning for any suspicious activity, while a detective from the nearest small city, Anna Kessler, drove in to coordinate with Hale. Henry hovered nearby as the children repeated their story: a surprise invasion at the luxury lodge, the staff's odd lack of reaction, the armed men rounding up Mark and Lillian. Charlotte described how she and Oliver escaped through a side door while the kidnappers were busy tying up their parents. Detective Kessler, a tall woman with keen blue eyes, frowned. "Charlotte, did you recognize any of the men? Had you seen them around the lodge before, maybe employees or guests?" Charlotte shook her head. "I don't think so. We got to the lodge just the day before. Mom wanted to use the spa, Dad was reading in the lounge. I was with Oliver in our room, playing a game. Then all of a sudden we heard shouting. We hid in the closet, but they found our parents." Kessler jotted notes. "What about the lodge staff? You said they didn't scream or fight back." "They didn't," Charlotte answered, trembling. "One of the men told them to stand aside, and they just did." Henry exchanged a worried glance with the detective. That suggested inside help, or staff too terrified to resist. Either possibility spelled trouble. Oliver chimed in quietly, I saw one staff member even open a door for them. Like, they were working with them. Kessler's brow furrowed deeply. All right, that's an important detail. We'll investigate the staff thoroughly. Sheriff Hale made a call to the FBI field office in the next state over, requesting assistance given the possibility of a trafficking operation. Meanwhile, Henry paced outside, phone in hand, trying to reach the lodge's management. No luck. Calls went unanswered or rang into a generic voicemail. The only alternative was to go there in person. Detective Kessler stepped out onto the depot's porch, phone pressed to her ear. She closed it with a snap. No answer from the lodge, right? She asked Henry. He nodded. Nothing. It's suspicious. We need a team to go up there, she said. Now. Count me in, Henry replied. I know the trails, the terrain. If the kidnappers are hiding somewhere off the main roads, I can help you navigate. She studied his determined expression. We'll appreciate the help. We'll keep a light footprint though, maybe just you, me, and a couple of deputies. We don't want to spook them if they're still on the property. Henry agreed. All right, let's move fast. If Mark and Lillian are still alive, time's ticking. They set off in 2 vehicles. Detective Kessler drove a dark, unmarked SUV, while Deputy Torres followed in a sheriff's cruiser. Henry accompanied Kessler, occasionally directing her to take back roads that would lead them closer to the lodge. The forest thickened around them, pines growing denser, branches scraping the sides of the car. The sky overhead was bright now, the sun well above the horizon, but Henry felt a darkness overshadowing the day's beauty. After nearly 45 minutes, they spotted the lodge in the distance, a tall, timber-framed structure perched on a gentle slope, overlooking a valley of towering evergreens. Under normal circumstances, it was a luxurious retreat for those who could afford such isolation. Now, it looked eerily still, no signs of life, no cars in the parking area. Kessler parked at the edge of the lodge's circular driveway, next to a well-manicured lawn and ornamental shrubs. Deputy Torres pulled in behind them. The 3 stepped out, hands instinctively hovering near their holstered weapons. Henry scanned the facade. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a rustic yet elegant interior, but no staff or guests were visible. Strange, he murmured. If it's business as usual, there should be someone at the front desk, at least. Kessler nodded, approaching the entrance warily. The glass doors slid open with a soft hiss, apparently still powered. Inside was a spacious lobby with a high ceiling, a grand fireplace, and plush chairs arranged around coffee tables strewn with travel brochures. Soft music played overhead. It felt unsettlingly normal, except for the complete absence of people. Hello, Deputy Torres called, stepping across polished stone floors. Her voice echoed. Anyone here? Silence answered. Henry moved behind the reception desk, scanning for any sign of disturbance. A computer was still on, the screensaver drifting lazily across the monitor. A quick glance around revealed no forced entry, no blood, no bullet holes. This is eerie, he said, frowning. Kessler kept her hand near her sidearm. Let's sweep the area. Check every room if we have to. They began a methodical search. Guest suites, conference rooms, the kitchen, storage closets. Nothing. Everything was tidy, as though the staff had simply vanished. Occasionally, a partially drunk cup of coffee or a half-eaten sandwich in the kitchen hinted at a hasty departure. Some guests' luggage sat unopened in a corridor. Deputy Torres paused at a housekeeping cart with neatly folded towels and sheets, left in the middle of a hallway. Henry tried not to let his imagination run wild, but the emptiness was downright spooky. As they rounded a corner, they heard a noise, something skittering behind a door marked "Employees Only." Kessler signaled for silence, drew her weapon, and carefully pushed the door open. Inside was a dimly lit office, a row of lockers, and a few chairs. They found a single employee there, cowering beneath a table, a young man in a rumpled housekeeping uniform, shaking like a leaf. Deputy Torres knelt beside him, speaking gently. Hey, it's okay. We're law enforcement. You're safe now. He peeked out, eyes brimming with fear. Are they gone? Kessler holstered her gun. Oh, the men who took the burns. He nodded, swallowing hard. Yes. Well, I think so. A bunch of them arrived. Told the staff to get out if we didn't want trouble. Some left willingly. I panicked and hid. Henry crouched, studying the trembling man. Do you know anything about staff involvement? The kids said some staff might have cooperated with the kidnappers. A flicker of guilt crossed his face. I don't know. Management was always hush-hush about certain special guests. Maybe they were involved? I just do housekeeping, I swear. When they told me to leave, I hid instead because I was scared they'd kill me. Kessler exchanged a look with Henry. You've been here the whole time? She asked. He nodded again. Yes. Been here about a day, I guess. I fell asleep behind that table. I don't even know what time it is anymore. Okay, Kessler said, standing. We'll get you medical attention. But first, anything you can tell us about where they might be holding Mark and Lillian Byrne? The kids said they were kidnapped. The man's eyes darted anxiously. I heard a rumor they were keeping them in some hidden place under the lodge. There's a basement, but it's not on the public map. Some staff used it for storage or other stuff. I never went down. It's behind a locked door near the spa area. That was something. Kessler wasted no time. She gestured for Henry and Torres to follow her, guiding the frightened employee to wait safely near the front desk. They made their way through the empty halls, turning down a corridor lined with wooden doors that read, Spa, Massage, Sauna. The smell of lavender and eucalyptus still lingered, incongruously peaceful. At the end of the corridor, they found a heavy door that looked more industrial than the lodge's usual rustic style. A keycard reader blinked red. Deputy Torres tried the handle. Looked. She glanced at Henry. Think we can force it? Henry examined the hinges. We can try. Kessler and Henry took turns ramming the door with their shoulders. It held firm. Finally, with enough force and a strategic kick near the lock, the door gave way, revealing a narrow flight of concrete steps leading down into darkness. A musty odor wafted up. Henry flicked on his flashlight, the beam illuminating the barren walls. Tension coiled in his gut. This was it, possibly where Mark and Lillian had been taken. But were they still here? They descended carefully, each step echoing. At the bottom, they reached another door, partially ajar. Henry peered inside, a corridor that stretched left and right, lined with small rooms that looked more like storage units or offices. He swallowed, stepping through, gun in one hand, flashlight in the other. Suddenly a voice barked from the darkness, "Freeze!" Henry's flashlight landed on a man dressed in black, aiming a pistol. A second figure emerged beside him. Kessler and Torres raised their weapons. The first man fired. The shot rang out, sparks flying as a bullet ricocheted off the concrete wall. Henry ducked, adrenaline surging. Kessler returned fire, forcing the gunman to retreat behind a stack of crates. Henry dove behind a corner, heart hammering. "We've got at least 2 suspects armed down here," he shouted to Torres. She nodded, pressing against the wall. "We can't let them hole up. We need them alive so we can find Mark and Lillian." Kessler advanced slowly, covering the corridor. Another shot whizzed past, skimming her shoulder, the bullet lodging in the doorframe. She hissed in pain, but remained on her feet. "I'm okay," she muttered, teeth gritted. Henry inched forward along the opposite side, shining his flashlight. He caught a glimpse of one of the suspects reloading. "Drop your weapons!" Henry shouted. "We have law enforcement covering every exit. You can't escape." A low snarl answered him, "Back off, or we'll kill the hostages." Henry's stomach turned. So Mark and Lillian were indeed here, or at least the kidnappers wanted them to think so. He glanced at Kessler, who nodded. They had to stall or attempt a swift takedown. Another bullet tore through the air, slamming into the crates behind which Henry crouched. Torres signaled that she would move to flank them. Henry created a distraction by aiming his flashlight away, momentarily throwing the suspects off. Then Kessler rattled a nearby metal shelf, drawing their attention. Torres lunged from a side nook, firing a single shot that struck one suspect's leg. He collapsed with a scream, dropping his gun. The second man pivoted to return fire, but Kessler fired a warning shot that sparked against the concrete floor. He froze, hands trembling, realizing he was pinned from both sides. Henry took the opportunity to rush in, forcing the man to the ground while Torres disarmed him. Panting, Henry pinned the suspect's arms. "Where are Mark and Lillian Byrne?" The man sneered through gritted teeth. "You're too late." Kessler kicked the gun away, ignoring the blood trickling from her grazed shoulder. "Check the rooms," she ordered Henry. "I'll keep an eye on these two." Henry scoured the corridor, trying each locked room. Some were filled with crates, boxes of supplies. He opened one to find stacks of what looked like forged identification papers, passports, money. Another contained crates of guns and ammo. Fear rippled through him. This wasn't just a small operation. It was a well-equipped trafficking ring. He found a final locked door at the very end. Something told him to hurry. He rammed it with his shoulder, grimacing at the jolt of pain. It didn't budge. With no time to be gentle, he fired at the lock. The metal shattered and he kicked the door in. The room beyond was dark and empty, no hostages. Just a circle of chairs, ropes, and scattered duct tape. A single overhead light bulb flickered, revealing signs that someone had been bound here recently, but the space was now deserted. Henry's heart sank. They'd likely moved Mark and Lillian before the police arrived. The men captured in the corridor were just the last to pack up or guard the place. He returned to Kessler and Torres, who had the suspects cuffed. Blood from the wounded man's leg pooled onto the concrete floor. "No sign of the burns," Henry said, dread lacing his words. "They were here, but they're gone." Kessler tightened her jaw. "Let's get paramedics in here for the suspect. We'll interrogate both of them as soon as possible. Maybe they know where the burns were taken." Henry felt a swirl of emotions, relief that the children were safe, frustration that their parents had just slipped through their grasp, and a deepening fear of what might happen to them next. He helped Torres radio in for backup, medics, and a forensics team. The basement had a trove of illegal items that would keep law enforcement busy for days. Soon, more officers arrived, securing the lodge. The wounded suspect was stabilized and taken into custody, while the other suspect glowered silently under the watch of two armed deputies. Forensics teams started cataloging everything: stolen IDs, stolen vehicles found in a back-loading bay, crates of weapons. It was no wonder the staff had fled or cooperated in fear. Henry and Kessler made their way back to the main lobby, stepping out into the midday sun. It should have been warm and comforting, but Henry felt only a chill. "We were so close," he muttered. "We could have found Mark and Lillian." Kessler exhaled, cradling her injured shoulder. "At least we shut down one of their hideouts. The kidnappers won't be able to use this place again. And we'll see what the suspects have to say once we interrogate them." Henry nodded, determination coalescing into a steely resolve. "We have to keep searching. Those kids are counting on us." Back at the Ranger Depot, Charlotte and Oliver had been anxiously waiting with Emma Caldwell. When they saw Henry's expression, Charlotte's face fell. "You didn't find them, did you?" Henry knelt beside the couch, heart heavy. "I'm sorry, Charlotte. They were gone by the time we got there. But we did arrest two of the men involved, and we found evidence. That means we're closer to tracking them down." Oliver looked like he might burst into tears. "So they're still missing?" Henry placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Yes, but we're not giving up." Sheriff Hale approached them. "Kids, you'll be staying under protective custody for the time being. We don't want these criminals coming after you. We'll take you somewhere safe, all right?" Charlotte swallowed, glancing up at Henry with pleading eyes. "Please, don't let them hurt Mom and Dad." "I won't," Henry promised, though a part of him seethed with worry, recalling the rescue that haunted him. He pushed the memory aside. "We'll do everything in our power to bring them home." Oliver sniffled, hugging Charlotte. "Thank you," he whispered, but his voice was laced with heartbreak. That evening, as dusk settled over Ironwood, the FBI finally arrived. Special Agent Frank Reynolds and Special Agent Teresa Mendez, accompanied by 2 other agents. They carried federal authority and an arsenal of investigative tools. Henry briefed them on the discovery at the lodge, the evidence, the suspects in custody. Mendez, sharp-eyed and methodical, took copious notes. Reynolds, older and more seasoned, grilled Henry about every detail, from the children's first statements to the crates in the basement. "So you believe this is part of a larger trafficking operation?" Reynolds asked, leaning against the depot's counter. Henry nodded. "Yes, the scale of that basement operation was too big for a one-off kidnapping. There were stacks of forged documents, weapons, definitely an organized ring." Agent Mendez tapped her pen on a notepad. "Any leads on where Mark and Lillian might have been taken next?" Henry sighed. "Nothing concrete. The suspects we caught refused to talk so far. But we'll keep pressing them." Sheriff Hale joined them, rubbing tired eyes. "We have roadblocks up on the highways leading out of the county, but these guys know how to slip around official routes." "We'll expand the net," Reynolds said. "We'll coordinate with state lines, put out an APB on the black van the kids mentioned. We'll also examine that contraband you found. Maybe the serial numbers or origin might point us to their next destination." Henry felt a flicker of hope. "In the meantime, I'll keep patrolling the forest roads. There are countless back routes, old logging trails, places off-grid. If they're trying to hide in the woods, I might spot them." Mendez agreed. "That'd be valuable. Just be careful. If this ring is as dangerous as we suspect, they won't hesitate to use violence." Henry understood the risks, but he couldn't sit idle. That night, he hardly slept, his mind racing with images of Mark and Lillian in chains somewhere, and the frightened faces of Charlotte and Oliver. The wind howled outside his modest cabin on the outskirts of the forest, rattling the windows. He remembered a time years ago when a call for help came too late. A teenage girl had fallen into a ravine, and Henry arrived moments after she passed. He carried that regret in his heart every single day. Now, he wouldn't let that happen again. He refused to let another family's life be torn apart on his watch. Morning brought a veil of fog over Ironwood. Henry made coffee, packed a thermos, and headed to the depot to meet with the FBI agents. They were already there, sifting through documents seized from the lodge. Mendez handed him a small stack of papers. "Take a look at this," she said, pointing to a typed ledger. "It's partial, pages are torn, but there are references to shipments, with dates and initials. Looks like some code. We suspect Mark and Lillian were part of that next shipment. We just need to decode the time and place." Henry frowned at the cryptic entries. "Any idea who's running the operation?" Reynolds shrugged. "We have a few names floating around in our database, but nothing definitive yet. The men in custody keep demanding lawyers, not talking. We'll break them eventually, but it might take time." Time they didn't have. Henry set down the papers, a knot of frustration in his chest. "I'll go check some old logging roads today. There's a network that winds through the southwestern quadrant, near the state border. Smugglers have been caught using them before." Mendez nodded. "Take a radio, keep us updated. And if you see anything suspicious, don't engage alone. Call it in." Henry forced a tight smile. "I'm not looking for a shootout. Just trying to find clues." He left in his Ranger truck, driving beyond the lodge toward remote sections of Ironwood. The forest thickened, roads turning to muddy tracks. Pines soared overhead, blocking much of the morning light. Occasionally he stopped to survey tire tracks or footprints, but nothing indicated a fresh lead. The sense of the forest's immensity weighed on him, So many places to hide. If the kidnappers had a head start, they might already be long gone. Despite the gloom, he pressed on, checking abandoned cabins, old logging sites, even an overgrown campsite near a narrow river. Nothing. By late afternoon, frustration gnawed at him. He radioed into the depot, hearing from Emma that Charlotte and Oliver were staying with Child Protective Services in a secure location. They were anxious but safe for the moment. Henry pictured them, huddled in a strange place, worrying about their parents. He redoubled his efforts, though the day yielded no breakthroughs. Back at the depot, the FBI announced they'd deciphered a small part of the ledger. Agent Mendez explained to Henry, "We believe a large delivery was slated for the end of this week, potentially the Burns among them, destined for an out-of-state location, possibly crossing 2 or 3 state lines." Henry's jaw clenched. "That means we have a deadline." Reynolds agreed. "Yes. We're in contact with agencies along those states' highways, but the ring might use back roads or private airstrips. We've flagged flight manifests, but no hits yet." Henry shook his head. "I'll keep searching the forest tomorrow. We can't lose them." 4 days, the tension escalated. The kidnappers' reach seemed vast. The 2 suspects in custody finally gave up small crumbs of information. A name here, a rumored safe house there. Enough to widen the net, but not enough for a direct location of Mark and Lillian. Every time Henry checked in with Charlotte and Oliver by phone, his heart ached. Charlotte tried to stay strong, but Henry sensed her fear underneath. Oliver barely spoke, just listened in silence. A break came unexpectedly from the battered ID papers found in the lodge basement. Forensic experts uncovered an address linked to a shell company that owned a vacant cabin on the far southwestern edge of Ironwood. Henry recognized the area, steep, rugged terrain, mostly uncharted for casual hikers. Agents Reynolds and Mendez organized a joint operation with the sheriff's department. They would approach quietly, search the cabin, see if it was being used as a hideout. Henry insisted on joining the operation, citing his knowledge of the terrain. "I know every inch of that region," he told Reynolds and Mendez. "You'll need someone to guide you on the logging roads, or you'll get stuck." Reynolds hesitated. "It might get dangerous, Ranger Dawson. These are armed criminals." "I understand, but I'm going. I need to see this through," Henry replied, voice unwavering. Reynolds exchanged a glance with Mendez, then nodded. "All right, we'll brief you. But remember, FBI leads the raid. We can't risk uncoordinated moves." Henry agreed. He'd follow protocol as best he could, but if he found Mark and Lillian, no power on earth would stop him from getting them out safe. They set off at dawn, a convoy of 2 unmarked SUVs carrying FBI agents, plus the sheriff's department's SUV with Sheriff Hale and Deputy Torres. Henry led in his Ranger truck, guiding them through winding gravel roads. As they got deeper into the forest, the path narrowed, tree branches scraping the vehicles. Thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around the tires. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs. Agent Mendez radioed from behind. "Visibility's poor. Keep us posted on any turns." "Copy," Henry answered. "We're about 10 minutes out from the coordinates." Sure enough, after a steep climb up a forested slope, they arrived at a hidden turnoff that led to a rundown wooden cabin. Henry parked behind a cluster of trees, the others following suit, shutting off their headlights. The place looked abandoned at first glance. Roof caved in places, windows boarded. But there were fresh tire tracks in the mud, a sure sign of recent activity. The FBI agents donned tactical gear. Reynolds led the briefing in hushed tones. "We'll split into 2 teams, circle the cabin. Watch for any movement. We breach only if we confirm suspects or hostages inside." Henry stood with them, pistol at his side, heart pounding. He could almost feel the forest bristling with tension, like it sensed the confrontation about to unfold. Sheriff Hale gave Henry a quick nod of respect, then took position with his deputy behind an outcropping of boulders, covering the cabin's flank. "Team Alpha, which included Henry, Agent Reynolds, and 2 other agents, crept along a tree line to approach the front of the cabin. Team Bravo, led by Mendez, circled around the back. They moved slowly, boots sinking into wet earth. Henry's breath puffed in the cold air. He scanned the windows, seeing no lights inside, no movement. But he caught the faint whiff of cigarette smoke drifting from somewhere. Reynolds raised a hand in a silent signal, then eased up to the front door. Henry could hear his own heartbeat roaring in his ears. The agent tested the door gently. Another agent prepared a small breaching charge. At that moment, a figure stepped onto the front porch, a cigarette between his lips. He froze at the sight of heavily armed agents. The cigarette dropped from his mouth. FBI! Reynolds shouted. Hands up! Instead, the man darted for his weapon. A thunderous crack split the air as the breaching charge accidentally detonated on the door, blasting it inward. The suspect scrambled off the porch, diving behind a stack of firewood. Gunfire erupted. Reynolds and the agents fired warning shots to pin him down. Henry ducked behind a thick pine, adrenaline surging. He caught sight of the man returning fire with a pistol, muzzle flashing in the dim morning light. Splinters flew from the logs as bullets struck them. Reynolds motioned for Henry to keep low. Then an agent lobbed a flashbang around the corner. The deafening pop and blinding flash caused the suspect to cry out. The next moment, the agents rushed him, knocking the gun from his hand. He struggled, but 3-on-1 was too much. They cuffed him face down in the mud. Meanwhile, Team Bravo forcibly entered the cabin from the back, shouting commands. Henry heard a flurry of movement inside. Shouts, a scream, and then a volley of gunfire that rattled the windows. Heart in his throat, Henry sprinted to the door. As he rushed in, the stench of mold and gunpowder hit him like a physical force. In the dim interior, overturned furniture and rotted floorboards formed a chaotic scene. Agent Mendez crouched behind a broken table, exchanging fire with someone in a back room. Henry spotted a second suspect lying motionless near the front window, a pool of blood spreading across the floor. The old nightmares threatened to surge up, but he forced himself to stay focused. "Do you see Mark or Lillian?" Henry shouted over the gunfire. Mendez shook her head, reloading her weapon. "Not yet. We think there's at least one more suspect in that back room." Henry crept behind a wooden pillar, inching closer. He glimpsed a door partially ajar. Gunshots whizzed past him, thudding into the wall behind. The suspect inside was cornered but desperate. Henry signaled to Mendez that he would try to flank from a side hallway. She nodded, covering him with suppressive fire. Slipping into the hallway, Henry spotted a side door that led into the same back room from another angle. It was locked, so he fired a round at the doorknob. The door creaked open. He heard the suspect shouting obscenities, threatening to kill any cops who entered. Henry exhaled to steady his nerves, then burst through, gun at the ready. The suspect, a lean man in dark clothes, whirled around, startled. Henry fired a shot that caught him in the shoulder, knocking him to the ground. The man howled in pain, weapon clattering. Henry kicked it away, heart hammering. Through the swirling dust and debris, he scanned the small room. No Mark, no Lillian. Only a messy table strewn with maps, papers, and a duffel bag. The walls were lined with battered shelves, a few flickering lanterns providing the only light. Agent Mendez entered from behind, gun trained on the suspect. He cursed, clutching his bleeding shoulder, but offered no further resistance. The cabin fell silent as other agents secured the perimeter. Henry's ears rang from the gunfire and adrenaline. Panting, he faced Mendez. "No burns," he managed. She shook her head, frustration etched on her features. "We'll search everywhere." While the other agents took the wounded suspect into custody, Henry quickly rifled through the documents on the table, heart pounding with hope. He found Polaroid photos of people bound and gagged. His stomach churned at the sight. He recognized Mark and Lillian in one of them, eyes wide with terror. The photo background looked different from this cabin, though. A partially visible sign behind them read something about deliveries. Agent Mendez, Henry said, voice shaking as he held the photo. They had Mark and Lillian. They took pictures of them. She grimaced. These people are sick. Any clue where they were taken next? Henry shuffled the papers. A map caught his eye, a region spanning Ironwood's southern edge and beyond. Certain routes were highlighted, but there were also cryptic notations referencing vault, main house, and a set of initials, Arch. Another page had a partial address, but it was smudged. It might be a safe house or drop-off location, Henry guessed. Mendez took pictures of the map with her phone. We'll get a forensics team to interpret. Keep looking. They scoured the rest of the cabin. The smell of damp rot made Henry's nose twitch. In a closet, he found boxes of clothing, some of which looked like they could belong to captured victims. Markings from different states, even foreign brand labels. Nothing that belonged to Mark or Lillian specifically, though. By the time the search concluded, the suspects had been taken away, the cabin secure. But Mark and Lillian remained missing. Outside, Henry stared at the looming pines, the weight of defeat pressing on him. Once again, they'd come so close to finding leads, yet the burns were still in the wind. Sheriff Hale joined him, pulling off his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. We'll keep trying, Henry. We'll find them. Henry exhaled heavily. At least we got some documents. Might lead us somewhere. Agent Reynolds emerged from the cabin, phone in hand. We're sending copies of the map and notes to our analysts. They might figure out the reference to this main house. My hunch is it's the ring's central hub. Henry squared his shoulders. Then that's where Mark and Lillian will be if they're still. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. If they're still alive. For the next few days, tension simmered to a boiling point. The FBI ramped up efforts, working with multiple states to track suspicious vehicles. The partial address from the cabin was researched. They discovered a property with high walls and no official listing in a nearby county. It sat on private land, accessible by unmarked roads. Locals sometimes whispered about shady goings on there. Agents Reynolds and Mendez believed it might be the so-called main house. During this time, Henry felt the toll of stress. He barely slept, haunted by mental images of Charlotte and Oliver's tear-streaked faces, of Mark and Lillian bound in some dark room. He patrolled daily, though leads in the forest were dwindling. At night, he'd drive to the secure facility where Charlotte and Oliver were staying, just to reassure them. They clung to him as though he was their last link to hope. And maybe he was. Any news? Charlotte would ask every time, voice husky with tears unshed. Henry would shake his head gently. We're close. We found more leads. Hang in there. He knew words did little to ease their pain, but he couldn't bring himself to stay away. He took comfort in their resilience. Even Oliver, though quiet, occasionally mustered a small smile for Henry. It reminded Henry of why he was fighting so hard. Finally, a major break arrived. FBI analysts decoded references in the seized documents, matching them to the rumored property's coordinates. They found mention of a scheduled auction, a horrifying detail implying multiple captives, possibly including Mark and Lillian, were to be sold to the highest bidder. The date matched the timeline Charlotte and Oliver had overheard, just 2 days away. At an emergency briefing in the Ranger Depot, the FBI laid out the plan, a coordinated raid on the main house. This time, a specialized tactical team would come in from the city, operators trained for high-risk hostage rescues. Sheriff Hale would support them with local deputies. Henry insisted on being involved, even if just as a guide to the property, which was rumored to be tucked behind thick woods. We're going in at dawn, Reynolds explained to the group. We'll approach from multiple angles, block any escape routes. Mendez will coordinate the assault team. Our top priority is rescuing the hostages safely. That means we can't just storm in, guns blazing. We need stealth and precise timing. Henry nodded. I can help navigate the old roads around that property. If there's a hidden back entrance or gate, I probably know where it might be. Mendez pressed her lips together. We appreciate your expertise, Ranger Dawson. But be aware, once we breach the property, it'll be a war zone. He gazed at the map on the wall, the property boundaries circled in red. I understand. Charlotte and Oliver came to mind. He had to make sure this ended well for them, and for himself. He wouldn't let them down, or let his own nightmares become reality again. The final day before the raid was spent in meticulous planning. The specialized tactical team arrived, running through scenarios with the FBI agents. Helicopter support was on standby at a nearby airstrip, in case the criminals tried to flee. Henry found himself trying to help in any way possible, sharing knowledge of the terrain, describing how thick the canopy got, how the ground might be slippery near certain creek beds. He even recalled times that local off-roaders claimed to see suspicious lights or vehicles near that part of the forest. That night, Henry visited Charlotte and Oliver for what he hoped would be the last time before reuniting them with their parents. He brought them small gifts, hand-carved wooden animals he'd whittled during quieter times. Charlotte thanked him softly, tears shining in her eyes as she held the little wooden fox. Oliver cradled a wooden bird, running his fingers along its wings. Tomorrow's the day, Henry said, kneeling in front of them. We think your parents are at this property. The FBI's going in. Charlotte's chin trembled. Are you going too? Yes, Henry replied. I'll be there to help. Oliver whispered, please be careful. Henry placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. I will. The moment we find them, I'll let you know. He said his goodbyes, heart heavy but determined. Tomorrow might change everything. Either they'd rescue Mark and Lillian, or risk losing them forever. The magnitude weighed on him like a boulder. Yet, strangely, a seed of hope had taken root. They had a plan, a specialized team, and a location. It was more than they'd had days ago. Dawn broke in pale pink hues, the forest cloaked in dawn mist. The convoy of law enforcement vehicles met at a staging area a few miles from the main house. Everyone was tense, double-checking gear. The specialized tactical team wore dark uniforms, bulletproof vests, helmets, and carried an array of weapons. Agents Reynolds and Mendez donned tactical gear as well, along with Sheriff Hale and a handful of deputies. Henry felt somewhat out of place in his ranger uniform, but he'd strapped on a vest the FBI provided and kept his standard-issue pistol holstered. A sense of finality thrummed in the air. They rolled out in coordinated waves, Henry leading the first group along a hidden trail. Within 15 minutes, they reached a vantage point overlooking the property, a tall wrought iron fence encircling a large mansion with a sprawling estate. The house itself was 2 stories, built in an old Southern style. A distant guard patrol, armed, walked the grounds. Through binoculars, Henry could make out more guards stationed on a balcony. Agent Mendez's voice crackled over Henry's earpiece. All units in position? Reynolds replied, Team Alpha in position near the main gate. Team Bravo ready at the east fence line. Henry pressed the transmitter. Ranger Dawson in position with Team Charlie on the northwest side. All right, Mendez said, her tone steady but urgent. On my signal, we breach the fence. We have confirmation of multiple hostages inside. Let's keep them safe. Henry peered through the pine branches, heart thudding. The guard near the fence was smoking, oblivious to the silent watchers among the trees. Then Mendez's voice came again, go. In near unison, the teams cut or scaled the fence at their designated points. Silencers on some rifles allowed them to take out the external guards swiftly. Henry followed behind an FBI agent who used bolt cutters on a section of chain link. This area, perhaps a discreet extension of the fence. They slipped inside, boots squelching on damp grass. Shouts erupted from the other side of the property, Team Alpha's confrontation with guards. Gunshots cracked the morning calm. Henry tried to keep his nerves steady, scanning the windows of the mansion for any sign of Mark and Lillian. The group advanced, hugging the shadows of tall hedges. More guards materialized, firing sporadically. The heavily armed FBI agents returned fire with grim precision. Henry heard a bullet whiz past, striking the trunk of a nearby tree. Bark exploded, showering him with splinters. He pressed against the hedge, adrenaline roaring in his veins. The specialized team pressed forward methodically, covering each other's advance. They reached a side door near what looked like a kitchen entrance. An agent planted a breaching charge. Henry stepped back, bracing himself. The door blew in, smoke and dust billowing. Agents rushed inside, scanning corners. Henry followed, pistol drawn. The kitchen was opulent. Marble countertops, a massive stove, expensive appliances, but deserted. They fanned out, clearing each room. The house was a labyrinth of corridors, plush carpets, and ornate wood paneling. Gunfire echoed from deeper inside. Agent Mendez's voice came over the earpiece. Top floor. Multiple hostages. Engaging suspects. Henry moved swiftly down a hallway with two agents, tension coiling in every muscle. They cleared a large dining room, a living area with tall windows that overlooked the front yard. Bodies of armed men and the occasional wounded FBI agent or deputy lay scattered, a testament to the firefight raging through the mansion. Up a grand staircase, Henry found the second floor in chaos. Agents crouched behind a gilded railing, exchanging fire with gunmen down a long corridor. A chandelier above swung precariously from the vibrations of gunshots. Mendez crouched near the stairs, reloading. She spotted Henry. They have a barricade near the end of the hall. Hostages are in a room beyond it. Henry's heart soared with hope. Mark and Lillian? She nodded. Likely. We also have intel there could be other captives. We can't risk a stray bullet. Before Henry could respond, an explosion rocked the corridor, a grenade or improvised device. Shards of paneling and drywall flew everywhere. Mendez dropped to the floor, shielding her head. Henry dove behind a toppled table, ears ringing. As the smoke cleared, he heard frantic screams from deeper in the corridor. Hostages. He lifted his head, seeing that a chunk of the wall had collapsed, revealing a glimpse of a large room. Several figures were huddled on the floor, bound or caged. Among them, Henry recognized the disheveled forms of Mark and Lillian Byrne. Mark. Lillian. Henry shouted, heart pounding. They appeared conscious but terrified, arms tied behind their backs. A guard hovered near them, weapon drawn, scanning the corridor. Agent Reynolds, battered but on his feet, yelled from the other side. Covering fire. A flurry of gunshots pinned down the guard. Henry took the chance, sprinting across the corridor. Another bullet grazed the table behind him, but he kept moving. In a burst of adrenaline, he lunged through the gap in the wall, tackling the guard from behind. The man fought, elbowing Henry in the ribs. Henry grunted, wrestling for control of the gun. At last, he wrenched it free, tossing it aside. A quick punch to the guard's jaw dropped him, and Henry pinned him, panting. Two FBI agents rushed in, securing the subdued guard with handcuffs. Henry scrambled over to Mark and Lillian, who were bound near a row of other frightened captives. Lillian's eyes went wide as she recognized him. Henry! She choked out the word, tears spilling down her cheeks. He fumbled with the ropes. Yes, it's me. Are you okay? Mark coughed, voice hoarse. You're fine, well, not hurt too badly. The kids, Charlotte, Oliver. They're safe, Henry said, tears stinging his own eyes as the ropes came loose. They escaped and came to me for help. Lillian sobbed, relief overwhelming her. Thank God. Henry pulled them into a quick embrace. They looked malnourished, bruised, but alive. He glanced at the other hostages, a handful of men and women in a similar state. Agents swiftly cut their bonds, helping them up. Mark clung to Henry's arm. We were so scared. They kept saying they'd sell us, ship us off. I couldn't bear the thought of the kids. Henry squeezed Mark's shoulder. They're waiting for you. Outside the corridor, the last of the gunfire died down. Agents called "clear" as they systematically subdued or neutralized the remaining criminals. The final barricaded door was kicked in, revealing more contraband and a few cowering thugs who surrendered immediately. The opulent mansion had turned into a war-torn wreck, bullet holes scarring the walls, shattered glass strewn across the floors. Paramedics arrived to treat the wounded. Mark and Lillian leaned on each other, trembling from shock. As soon as Henry led them out of that house, Lillian looked up at the gray morning sky and wept in relief. Mark steadied her, tears glistening in his own eyes. Agent Mendez approached with a med kit, gently checking Lillian's vitals. "You'll both be taken to a hospital. Just a precaution." Mark swallowed. "Thank you. You saved us." Henry's chest tightened with emotion. "No," he said quietly. "Your kids saved you by running for help. I just did my job." Lillian clasped Henry's hand, voice quivering. "You did more than your job." Within hours, news spread through the county and beyond. The FBI had raided a major trafficking ring's safe house, freeing multiple hostages. Arrests and evidence seized at the main house would cripple the operation. Local authorities still had plenty of work to do: paperwork, statements, prosecuting the criminals, but the immediate threat to Mark and Lillian Byrne was over. At the hospital, Henry stood by as doctors checked Mark and Lillian for injuries. Bruises, dehydration, stress, but otherwise they'd be okay. Meanwhile, the news was relayed to Charlotte and Oliver, who rode in a police car to be reunited with their parents. Henry waited anxiously in the hospital corridor, anticipating that moment. He wanted to see the family together again, safe from the horrors they'd endured. Then the elevator doors opened. Charlotte and Oliver rushed out, guided by Deputy Torres. The children's eyes lit up when they spotted their mom and dad in the waiting area. Without waiting for permission, Charlotte and Oliver sprinted forward. Lillian opened her arms just in time for them to collide in a tearful embrace. Mark fell to his knees, hugging both kids as if he'd never let them go again. Oliver wept openly, pressing his face into Mark's shoulder. "I was so scared, Dad." Mark wrapped his arms around him. "I'm here, son. It's over." Charlotte clung to Lillian, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mom? Oh, Mom, I thought we'd never see you again." Lillian stroked her daughter's hair, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, she whispered, "You were so brave." Henry watched from a short distance, blinking away the moisture in his own eyes. He felt an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. The memory of that past rescue, the one he'd failed, softened just a little. This time, the story ended differently. After several minutes, Mark beckoned Henry closer. "You have no idea what you've done for us," Mark said, voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you." Lillian stood, hugging Henry tightly, unashamed of the tears on her face. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call us," she said, eyes filled with sincerity. Henry patted her back gently. "Just focus on getting better, on being together again. That's all I need." Charlotte and Oliver flung themselves at him, the older sister leading the charge. He wrapped an arm around each. Oliver sniffled. "You saved them." Henry's eyes burned. "I had help, but I'm glad I could do my part." "You're our hero," Charlotte murmured. Henry felt a surge of emotion, remembering how he'd once failed to save a life. Now, hearing these words, he realized that maybe he'd found redemption. Gently, he ruffled Oliver's hair, smiling through tears. "You two were the bravest of all. Running away like that, finding help. Your parents are safe because of you." Soon, paramedics ushered Mark and Lillian for more thorough exams, while a social worker led Charlotte and Oliver to a quieter waiting room. The hospital staff gave the family time alone to begin healing from their ordeal. Henry stepped back, letting them have privacy. He felt relief, exhaustion, and gratitude swirling within him. Outside, near the hospital's entrance, Agent Mendez found him. She had a bandage on her arm from a minor scrape. "We're still counting the hostages we rescued," she said. "Could be over a dozen from multiple states. We recovered a mountain of evidence to dismantle the ring." "Good work, Henry." He nodded wearily, leaning against a pillar. "I'm just glad the Burns are safe." Reynolds appeared as well, crossing his arms. "We'll be in touch for statements and all that. But for now, take a break. You've earned it." Henry looked at them both, a small smile forming. "Thanks. And thanks for letting me be part of it." They left him then, returning to coordinate the next steps in the case. Henry lingered outside the hospital, breathing in the fresh air. The day was bright now, golden sunlight spilling over the parking lot. After days of tension and dread, it felt surreal to stand in the warmth of a successful rescue. A soft voice startled him from his thoughts. "Ranger Dawson?" He turned to see Charlotte in the doorway, overshadowed by the hospital corridor behind her. She walked up shyly. "Mom and Dad are resting, but I just wanted to say, thank you again. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found us." Henry crouched a bit to be at eye level with her. "Charlotte, you and Oliver were so strong and smart. You got away, and that's why we could save your parents." Her eyes glistened. "We couldn't have done it alone." He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm just glad you're all okay now." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then, as if recalling a question she'd been dying to ask, Charlotte leaned forward. "Henry, you seemed so determined, like this was personal. Why?" The question caught him off guard. He considered how to answer. Finally he sighed. "Years ago, I tried to rescue someone, a young girl who was lost. I couldn't save her in time. I promised myself I'd never let that happen again." Charlotte's eyes were warm with understanding. "I'm sorry, but you saved us." He smiled softly. "Yeah, I did." She gave him a swift hug, then ran back inside to be with her parents, leaving Henry there with a sense of resolution he hadn't felt in years. The next few days were a whirlwind of aftermath. The FBI, state troopers, and local sheriff's department processed the massive crime scene at the mansion. Warrants were issued for top-level figures in the trafficking ring, some of whom had fled. But with the evidence gathered, plus testimonies from Mark, Lillian, and the other rescued hostages, law enforcement had enough to dismantle the operation piece by piece. Henry spent much of his time at the Ranger Depot or the hospital, assisting with final statements, guiding FBI teams to other rumored stash sites in Ironwood, or simply dropping in to check on the Burns. Charlotte and Oliver bounced back quicker than their parents, who remained haunted by nights of captivity. Mark had bruised ribs and a deep emotional scar. Lillian had nightmares. Yet they leaned on each other, healing slowly. One afternoon, the Byrne family was officially discharged, returning to a safer location outside the county. Before they left, they held a private gathering in the Ranger Depot to thank Henry and the local authorities. It was small and heartfelt. Mark shook Henry's hand, voice trembling with gratitude. Lillian embraced him, tears in her eyes but a relieved smile on her lips. Charlotte and Oliver gave him homemade thank you cards. They parted with promises to stay in touch, to visit Ironwood under kinder circumstances one day. Watching them drive away, Henry felt an odd mixture of sadness to see them go and peace at knowing they were free to move on. In that moment, he realized he had let go of some of his own guilt, replaced by the knowledge that sometimes you could save a life, and that mattered more than the times you failed. The FBI agents eventually wrapped up their field operations, leaving behind a few staff for ongoing investigations. Sheriff Hale eased back into the county's calmer routine. Emma Caldwell, who had cared for the kids early on, gave Henry a tearful grin one morning at the depot. "You really did it, Henry. You saved that family," she said, pride shining in her eyes. He nodded, gently setting a stack of paperwork on a desk. "Couldn't have done it without all of you." Emma waved a hand dismissively. "Still, it's good to see something end in hope." Henry walked outside, where the midday sun filtered through tall pines. A breeze rustled the branches overhead. For the first time in a while, he felt no twinge of dread in his chest, no ghost of an old rescue haunting him. He closed his eyes, exhaling. Later that day, as he patrolled a peaceful stretch of Ironwood, he found himself at the very clearing where he'd first spotted Charlotte and Oliver. The memory of them trembling in fear struck him, but it was overshadowed by the final image: both kids running into their parents' arms at the hospital. The sun's warmth on his face felt like a quiet affirmation. He inhaled, letting the forest's hush surround him, then continued along the trail, content in the knowledge that this time, the story ended in triumph. Time passed, and Henry carried on as Ironwood's dedicated ranger. Yet he was changed by the experience. He volunteered for extra training in crisis intervention and search and rescue. He led efforts to update the forest's security measures, wanting to ensure criminals would never again exploit its remote areas so easily. And though the memory of losing that teenager long ago would always remain, Henry no longer felt it as an open wound. Rescuing the Byrne family, especially Charlotte and Oliver, had closed a painful chapter in his life. Occasionally, postcards arrived from the Byrnes, featuring pictures of them smiling, healthy, healing. On the last postcard, Charlotte wrote a short note in neat handwriting: "Thank you for giving us our family back. We'll never forget Ironwood, and we'll never forget you." Henry kept the postcard pinned to a corkboard in his cabin, a reminder that even in a dark world, compassion and courage could still shine bright. He continued his life's work in the forest he loved, always ready to protect both nature and the people who ventured there. And every once in a while, he'd pause and reflect on how unwavering commitment and a refusal to give in to despair had led to a victory that might have seemed impossible. In the end, it was simple. He'd promised to save them, and he did. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and believe in standing up for the truth, be sure to like and subscribe for more. We appreciate every single one of you, and we'll see you next time.